"We are alone. Let's do what is necessary," the Apache woman whispered mockingly. The sun was barely rising over the distant horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The desert was quiet except for the faint rustling of dry bushes in the morning breeze. In this vast and isolated landscape, a small group of people moved carefully across the sand and rocks, carrying tools, backpacks, and equipment necessary for their work. They were a team of archaeologists, historians, and researchers, sent to study an ancient site that had long been rumored to contain traces of Apache history. Among them was Ayana, a young woman with deep brown eyes and hair tied back in a loose braid. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that made her presence noticeable even without trying. Unlike the others, she was not just there for research. Yana was a descendant of the Apache tribe, and this journey was personal for her. Every step she took on this land reminded her of the stories her grandmother had told her about ancestors who had walked the same deserts, hunted in these sands, and protected their sacred grounds. The team had set up camp near the edge of a rocky plateau. Small tents flapped lightly in the breeze, and a fire pit was surrounded by stones carefully arranged to hold burning wood. The smell of coffee mingled with the crisp morning air. The researchers were discussing their plans for the day when Hyana quietly observed the surroundings. The desert was unforgiving. The sun would rise higher and make the sand burn beneath their feet, and the wind could whip suddenly, carrying fine dust that stung the eyes and throat. She knew the importance of being prepared, not just physically but mentally. To her, the land was alive. It spoke in subtle ways, the way the sand shifted, the way the birds circled, even the way shadows stretched across the rocks. Each detail mattered. As the team moved closer to the site, Ayana noticed subtle signs that the land had been visited recently. Small footprints, disturbed sand, and scattered stones hinted that someone had been there before them. She kept her thoughts to herself, understanding that the others might not see or understand the significance. For Ayana, these were not just clues, they were warnings. The land had a history, and that history was fragile. Protecting it was not merely an academic duty, it was a responsibility handed down through generations. The other team members were busy unpacking tools and measuring equipment. There was Daniel, a senior archaeologist with decades of experience but a tendency to be impatient. His curiosity sometimes bordered on obsession, and he had a habit of rushing into situations without fully considering consequences. Then there was Maya, a young historian fascinated by Apache culture, eager to learn and document everything. Her enthusiasm often led her to ask countless questions, and though it sometimes frustrated the older members, her energy kept the team moving forward. Finally, there was Thomas, a field photographer whose camera followed every step they took, capturing moments in crisp detail. He was quiet but observant, always ready to notice what others missed. Together, they formed a team with a mix of experience, knowledge, and fresh perspective. Yet, beneath the professional appearance, tensions occasionally simmered. Each of them had their own motivations, and the desert, with its isolation, magnified both their strengths and their weaknesses. Ayana led the team toward a narrow canyon, carefully pointing out landmarks that she recognized from old maps and stories. The canyon walls rose sharply, casting shadows that danced as the sun climbed higher. Tiny lizards scurried over rocks, and the distant sound of a bird's call echoed through the cliffs. As they walked, Ayana told stories of her ancestors, not just about battles and survival, but about the wisdom embedded in the land. She spoke of how every plant, every stone, and every water source held meaning. Daniel listened politely but impatiently, occasionally glancing at his notes and muttering about schedules and objectives. Maya's eyes shone with curiosity, absorbing every word, while Thomas captured the sunlight filtering through the canyon on his camera. By midday, they reached a flat area surrounded by rocky outcrops. Iana paused and gestured for the others to stop. She crouched down, brushing away sand and pebbles, revealing faint markings on a rock that could have been made centuries ago. "These markings," she said softly, "are messages. Our ancestors left them for us to understand the land, to remember events, to warn us of dangers. We must be careful here." Daniel nodded, though his impatience was visible. "We'll document them quickly," he said, checking his instruments. Maya knelt beside Ayana, her notebook open, scribbling observations, while Thomas circled around to get the perfect photograph. Ayana's heart raced. She knew that not everyone truly understood the weight of what they were seeing. To her, these markings were not just data. They were a connection to a past that could vanish if mishandled. As the afternoon sun rose higher, the heat began to press down on the group. Shadows shortened, and the desert's quiet intensity became almost unbearable. Ayana led them to a small shaded area near a natural rock formation, where they could rest and drink water. She took out a small notebook of her own, filled with sketches and notes passed down from her grandmother. Each page was filled with observations, stories, and warnings about the land. She compared the markings they had just seen with her notes, realizing that they were part of a larger story, one that many people outside her community might never understand. While the team rested, a light breeze stirred up dust, and for a moment, Ayana felt a shiver run down her spine. She wasn't afraid of the desert itself, but of the carelessness of people who might not respect it. The isolation made her words from earlier, words she had whispered in a joking yet serious tone, linger in her mind. "We are alone, let's do what is necessary." The desert, she thought, demanded respect. Alone here, far from the safety of civilization, every decision mattered. Every action had consequences. As evening approached, the group set up their tents again and gathered around the fire pit. The sun sank low, casting long shadows across the sand. Jana looked at her team members, noticing small changes in their expressions. The fatigue, the curiosity, the growing awareness of their isolation. They were far from anyone who could help them if something went wrong. The desert had a way of teaching lessons quickly, and she silently hoped that they would learn without harm. She volunteered to prepare the first watch for the night, knowing the desert could become treacherous once darkness fell. The wind picked up, carrying sand that whispered across the camp. Jana walked along the perimeter, eyes scanning the surroundings. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was filled with tiny points of light. The quiet was profound, almost sacred. For her, this moment was not just about safety. It was a time to feel connected to those who had walked these lands long before her. By the end of the first day, the team had already begun to understand that this journey was not just about research. It was about respect, awareness, and survival in a harsh but beautiful environment. They had glimpsed traces of history that few people had ever seen, and the weight of responsibility rested heavily on their shoulders. Jana knew that the coming days would challenge them in ways they could not yet imagine. But for now, as the fire crackled and shadows danced around the camp, she allowed herself a quiet moment of pride. She had led them safely this far, and she felt the presence of her ancestors guiding her steps. The night deepened, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Every sound, the whisper of the wind, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of sand, felt amplified. Jana returned to the campfire, sitting quietly as the others drifted into sleep. Her mind was alert, her senses sharp, but there was also a sense of calm. They were alone here, yes, but that solitude carried its own power. It reminded them of the importance of every choice, every step, and every moment of awareness. Tomorrow, they would continue their exploration, face challenges they could not yet foresee, and learn lessons only the desert could teach. For now, Ayana let the quiet wash over her. The first day had been long, exhausting, and filled with subtle revelations. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that the journey had only just begun. The desert, with its harsh beauty, had welcomed them, and it would demand much more before their mission was complete. And deep down, she knew that her whispered words, half warning, half jest, would resonate in ways none of them could yet understand. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the rocks and sand in a harsh, golden light. The team had awoken to a strange quietness, the kind that always comes before something unexpected. Iana sensed it immediately. There was a weight in the air, a subtle shift in the wind, and even the birds seemed to have vanished from the sky. She felt the hair on the back of her neck rise and knew that today, the desert would challenge them in a way that would test not just their skills, but their hearts and minds. Daniel, unaware of Ayana's unease, was already walking ahead, inspecting the rocky terrain with his measuring tools. "We need to finish documenting this section before the afternoon," he said, almost to himself, his eyes scanning every crevice and shadow. Maya, carrying her notebook, tried to keep pace with him, jotting down observations, asking him questions about every detail. Thomas followed more slowly, capturing photographs of the rocks, shadows, and faint markings on stones that hinted at stories long forgotten. Yana, however, stayed slightly behind, watching the wind as it picked up, swirling tiny grains of sand into the air. By midday, clouds had begun to gather on the horizon. At first they were thin and wispy, almost harmless, but soon they thickened and darkened, covering the sun in a heavy gray blanket. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the desert's heat was replaced by an eerie coolness. Yana stopped the team and pointed toward the growing storm. "We need to return to camp," she said calmly but firmly. "A storm is coming and it won't wait for us." Daniel frowned, checking his instruments. "We're so close to finishing this site, we can't stop now. We'll just work a little longer." His voice was impatient, almost defiant. Maya looked uncertain, torn between her eagerness to explore and Ayana's warning. Thomas lowered his camera, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Ayana knew she had to act quickly. She stepped forward, her eyes meeting Daniel's. "I understand your excitement, but this isn't just about finishing. This is about surviving. Trust me, you don't want to be caught in this storm out here." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed, and the group began their careful journey back to camp. The wind had begun to howl now, carrying sand and small pebbles across the open terrain. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the canyon walls seemed to close in around them. Yana led, moving with confidence, her eyes scanning for every small detail, the direction of the wind, the safest paths over rocks, and any possible shelter. The others followed, their steps slower and more cautious than before. It was during this journey that the storm truly revealed itself. The wind picked up with a force that knocked against them, sand hitting their skin like tiny needles. Visibility dropped to almost nothing as dust filled the air, and the sky turned a deep, threatening gray. The team had no choice but to huddle together, holding onto each other's arms to avoid being swept off balance. Yana's voice rose above the roar of the wind. "Stay close. Keep moving," she shouted, guiding them toward a natural alcove she had spotted earlier. The alcove was small, just enough to provide shelter for the group. They crawled into it, huddling together for warmth and protection. The storm raged outside, a deafening roar of wind, sand, and sudden bursts of thunder. Inside the alcove, the group could finally breathe, but tension hung thick in the air. Daniel's pride was bruised. He hated feeling powerless. Maya looked frightened, gripping her notebook as though it could shield her from the chaos. Thomas was silent, eyes wide as he watched the storm batter the rocks outside. Yana, however, remained calm. She had survived deserts, storms, and challenges far worse in her life. She understood that panic would only make the situation worse. Hours passed and the storm showed no signs of relenting. Water and food were limited, and the team realized they would have to ration carefully. The isolation was absolute. No help could reach them here. In this intense solitude, small conflicts began to surface. Daniel grew impatient, suggesting they leave the alcove despite Ayana's warning. Maya argued, trying to mediate, while Thomas quietly observed, documenting the storm in his mind for later photographs and notes. It was then that the true test of character appeared. Daniel, driven by ambition and frustration, attempted to retrieve an artifact that had been partially buried in the sand outside the alcove. Ayana caught sight of him just in time. "Stop!" she shouted, stepping in front of him. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with intensity. "Do you understand what you're risking? Not just your life, but everyone else's." Daniel froze, realizing the gravity of the situation. The artifact, though precious, was insignificant compared to their safety. Ayana's words reminded them all that the desert did not forgive mistakes. In that moment, the team understood the delicate balance between curiosity, ambition, and survival. The storm had stripped away distractions, leaving only the essentials: trust, courage, and respect for nature. As night fell, the storm's fury continued. The alcove provided minimal protection, but it was enough to keep them alive. Ayana used her knowledge of the desert to guide them through small tasks: rationing water, finding slight depressions in the rock where sand and dust did not accumulate, and using their own clothing and gear to block the wind. Her calm leadership gave the others hope and strength. Even Daniel, who had been reckless earlier, began to listen, realizing that his pride could not protect him from nature's power. During the long hours of the night, the storm became a teacher. It revealed hidden fears, tested their patience, and showed who could think clearly under pressure. Ayana encouraged conversation, asking the others to share stories, memories, and lessons from their past. This simple act helped them stay grounded, reminding them that they were more than just researchers. They were human beings facing one of the most powerful forces on Earth together. By early morning, the storm began to subside. The wind slowed, the sky lightened to a muted gray, and the first rays of sun touched the sand once again. The desert, which had seemed threatening and merciless just hours before, now felt calm, almost forgiving. The team emerged from the alcove exhausted but alive. Their clothes were covered in dust, their skins sunburned from the harsh wind, but their spirits were strengthened by the ordeal. Ayana looked at the group, noting the changes in each of them. Daniel, humbled by the experience, offered a quiet apology for his recklessness. Maya, though tired, was smiling, filled with a sense of accomplishment and relief. Thomas was already adjusting his camera, eager to capture the aftermath of the storm, though his expression held a newfound respect for nature's power. The events of the storm had left a lasting impression. The team realized that survival was not just about skill, but about trust, respect, and unity. Ayana's whispered words from earlier, "We are alone, let's do what is necessary," now carried a deeper meaning. They were alone, yes, but in that solitude they had found clarity. They had learned that true courage was not in reckless actions, but in careful decisions made for the well-being of everyone. As they returned to camp to rest and recover, the desert seemed to hum quietly around them. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. Every footprint, every artifact, every stone held significance. The team's bond had grown stronger, forged in the crucible of the storm. They understood that the challenges ahead would test them further, but they were now better prepared, mentally, physically, and emotionally, to face whatever the desert might throw their way. Ayana walked ahead, scanning the landscape for safe paths and potential hazards. She felt a quiet pride in the team's resilience. They had faced the storm, faced their own fears, and survived. But she also knew that the desert had more to teach them. The turning point had come, but the journey was far from over. Each day would bring new trials, new discoveries, and new lessons about the delicate balance between human ambition and the power of nature. As they approached the edge of the camp, the sun rose fully over the horizon, illuminating the desert in brilliant gold. The storm was gone, leaving behind a landscape transformed, sand sculpted into new shapes, rocks polished by wind, and the sky clear and endless. The team paused for a moment, taking in the beauty and the harshness of the land. Iana allowed herself a brief smile. They had survived, but more importantly, they had learned. The desert had shown them the value of patience, respect, and the strength found in unity. And in that quiet morning light, as the wind carried the faint scent of rain-soaked sand, Iana knew that the turning point they had just experienced would stay with them forever. It had changed not just their understanding of the desert, but their understanding of themselves. The morning after the storm arrived quietly, almost peacefully. The desert, which had been fierce and unrelenting the previous day, now seemed calm and reflective, as if it were offering a chance to heal and take stock. The wind had slowed to a gentle whisper, carrying the scent of wet sand and dust. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting soft golden light across the rocky landscape. The team gathered near the camp, still exhausted from the ordeal, but the sense of tension that had gripped them during the storm had softened into a new understanding. Iana moved through the camp first, her eyes scanning everything. She noticed footprints that had been altered by the storm, small piles of sand that now covered fragile markings, and subtle changes in the landscape. The desert had changed in the night, just as it always did. She knew that the land was resilient, but it was also delicate, and human carelessness could leave permanent scars. For her, the storm had been a lesson in humility, but she also realized that it had been a lesson for the others. Daniel emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes. The exhaustion was visible on his face, but there was also a quiet change in his demeanor. He approached Iana, his voice subdued. I understand now," he said. "I was too focused on getting results and not focused enough on the dangers or the meaning of this place." "I'm sorry." Iana nodded, accepting his words, but she did not comment further. Actions, she thought, always spoke louder than words. The storm had humbled him, and that humility was more valuable than any apology. Maya, still holding her notebook, looked up with bright eyes despite the fatigue. "I've never felt anything like that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was terrifying, but it made me realize how much respect this land deserves. It's not just about history or artifacts. It's about survival, about understanding what came before us." Iana smiled softly. She had hoped that someone like Maya would learn this lesson. The younger woman's curiosity had not dimmed, but it had matured. She would approach her work with more care and awareness from now on. Thomas, carrying his camera, remained mostly silent. He had captured photographs of the storm's aftermath, documenting the sculpted sand, rocks, and debris. Yet even as he worked, he seemed reflective. The storm had reminded him that nature's beauty was inseparable from its power. Every photograph he took now carried more weight, a silent acknowledgement of the forces that could not be controlled. After a brief breakfast, the team gathered to assess the site and their findings. The storm had altered much of the terrain. Some markings and artifacts had been partially buried, while others were exposed. The team realized that their initial assessments needed revision. Daniel admitted that his haste to document quickly had almost caused irreversible mistakes. Maya carefully recorded the altered landscape, while Thomas captured images to compare with previous notes. Iana guided the process, offering insights from her ancestral knowledge. She understood that every shift in the desert held meaning, and that even small observations could tell stories about how her ancestors had lived, traveled, and protected the land. As they worked, the team began to discuss what had happened during the storm. They spoke openly about their fears, their decisions, and the choices they had made. The conversation was honest, even emotional. Daniel admitted his recklessness, and the group acknowledged that the desert had taught them a lesson in humility. Maya shared how the fear had made her realize the value of teamwork and trust. Thomas, too, spoke of the storm's lesson, the importance of observing and respecting the environment. In that moment, the desert became not just a place of work, but a teacher. Yana led a small walk around the camp, showing the others subtle signs left by the storm. She pointed to faint trails in the sand that revealed where small animals had taken shelter, to patterns in the rocks that indicated how water would flow during a heavy rain, and to areas where ancient markings had been partially preserved, despite the storm's fury. Each observation was a lesson in patience, observation, and respect. The team listened intently, realizing that their work was no longer just about documenting artifacts. It was about understanding the balance between human activity and the natural world. By mid-afternoon, the team decided to resume work at the main site, carefully retracing their steps from before the storm. The terrain was still challenging, but the desert felt less threatening now. It had tested them, but it had also allowed them to grow. They moved slowly, deliberately, paying attention to every detail. Jana walked ahead, her senses alert, guiding them past areas that were unstable or dangerous. Her leadership was no longer questioned. The storm had proven her knowledge and experience invaluable. During their exploration, they discovered a small alcove partially hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Inside were faint markings on the wall, perhaps from centuries ago. Jana approached them carefully, her hands hovering over the surface without touching it. "These are messages," she explained softly. "They tell stories of survival, of caution, of life here long before us. They survived storms like the one we faced. We must treat them with the same care." Daniel leaned closer, humbled, while Maya sketched the markings in her notebook. Thomas photographed them, capturing not just the images, but the sense of reverence that Ayana had instilled in them. As the day continued, the group found themselves reflecting on the personal lessons of the storm. Each member realized how fragile life could be, how easily mistakes could lead to disaster. But they also recognized the strength that comes from working together, from trusting one another, and from respecting forces greater than themselves. The desert had shown them both fear and beauty, and in that balance, they found a deeper appreciation for their work and for each other. As evening approached, the team returned to camp once again. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the sand, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain from distant clouds. The group was tired but content. They had survived the storm, preserved the site, and learned lessons that no textbook could ever teach. Yana sat quietly by the fire, watching the others settle in. She felt a quiet pride in their growth and understanding. The storm had tested them, but it had also united them. That night, as they sat around the campfire, Yana spoke softly about the lessons of the day. She told them stories of her ancestors who had lived in harmony with the land, surviving harsh conditions not by force, but by understanding, observing, and respecting the environment. She explained that survival was not just physical, it was mental and spiritual as well. The desert demanded humility, patience, and courage. The team listened, absorbing her words, and felt the weight of the knowledge she shared. Daniel, once impatient and reckless, admitted how much he had learned. Maya, inspired and wiser, spoke of how she would approach her work differently from now on. Thomas, thoughtful and reflective, expressed a newfound respect for the desert and its power. Together, they realized that the storm had changed not only their perspective on the land, but on themselves. They were no longer just a group of researchers. They were a team forged by adversity, aware of the responsibilities they carried, and deeply connected to the history and life of the desert. As the fire burned low, the stars began to appear, scattered across the clear night sky. The desert, which had seemed so hostile just a day ago, now felt alive with quiet beauty. Iyana looked up at the sky, thinking of her ancestors and the wisdom passed down through generations. She understood that the desert's lessons were ongoing, that every day held the potential for new discoveries, challenges, and growth. The storm had been a turning point, but the journey of understanding and respect would continue. Before sleep claimed them, the team members quietly reflected on the day. The fear, tension, and uncertainty of the storm had left a lasting impression, but so had the courage, teamwork, and resilience they had shown. They had learned to rely on each other, to listen, and to respect both the land and the people who had come before them. For Ayanna, this was perhaps the most important lesson, that the survival of knowledge, culture, and history depended not just on preserving artifacts, but on nurturing understanding and respect in those who encountered them. By the end of the night, the desert was calm once again. The camp was silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional whisper of wind. Each member of the team slept with a sense of accomplishment and a new awareness of their responsibilities. They had faced a challenge that tested their courage, skill, and morality, and had emerged stronger for it. Ayanna closed her eyes, knowing that the lessons learned during the storm would guide them in the days to come. She also knew that the desert had more to teach, and that they must remain vigilant, respectful, and humble in the face of its power. As the first light of dawn touched the desert, the team prepared to continue their work, aware that each step forward was an opportunity to honor the past, respect the present, and protect the future. The storm had passed, but its lessons had left an enduring mark on their hearts. They were no longer just observers of history. They were participants in a living story, responsible for carrying its truths with care and integrity. The desert stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the warm, golden light of early morning. After the storm, everything seemed renewed, yet changed. The sand was patterned with the traces of wind, rocks were polished smooth in some areas, and the once familiar paths now looked subtly different. The team prepared for another day of exploration, but the mood was lighter, calmer, filled with a sense of accomplishment and reflection. Each of them carried the memories of the storm and the lessons it had taught, aware that every step forward would be informed by their experience. Ayanna walked ahead, her eyes scanning the landscape. Her senses were attuned to every detail, the way the sand shifted, the subtle marks of wildlife, the faint shadows that hinted at hidden crevices. She felt the presence of her ancestors in the quiet of the morning, a connection that gave her strength and clarity. As she led the team toward a newly discovered section of the site, she shared stories and insights, helping the others understand the significance of what they were seeing. Each rock, each marking, each formation was part of a story, and she wanted them to understand not just the history, but the respect it demanded. Daniel, now humbled and thoughtful, walked beside her. The storm had changed him in ways that words could barely capture. He no longer rushed, no longer allowed his ambition to override caution or respect. Instead, he moved carefully, observing and listening, learning from both Ayanna and the desert itself. Maya followed, notebook in hand, her curiosity sharpened by experience. She had seen the desert's power firsthand and understood the delicate balance between exploration and preservation. Thomas brought up the rear, camera in hand, capturing images that reflected both beauty and reverence. The team arrived at a small plateau that overlooked a narrow canyon. From this vantage point, they could see the terrain stretching far into the distance, marked by ancient stone formations and subtle signs of past human presence. Ayanna pointed out faint trails in the sand, likely left by people centuries ago, and small markings etched into rocks that had survived generations. "Our ancestors walked these paths," she said softly. "They survived storms, adapted to the land, and left lessons for those who came after them. Every mark has meaning. We must honor it." They began to carefully explore the plateau, documenting what they found without disturbing the natural or historical integrity of the site. Daniel measured and recorded, Maya sketched and noted, and Thomas photographed, but each action was now guided by a new sense of responsibility. Ayanna watched them closely, proud of the growth she had seen. The storm had been a turning point, but this moment, working with focus, care, and respect, felt like a true achievement. As they explored, they discovered a small alcove hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Inside, ancient markings decorated the walls, telling stories of survival, community, and wisdom. Iana approached them carefully, tracing her fingers over the carvings without touching, explaining their significance. "These messages were not meant for fame or profit," she said. "They were meant to teach, to guide, and to remind us of what is important: respect, courage, and understanding." Daniel leaned closer, humbled, while Maya documented the markings in her notebook. Thomas captured their detail in photographs, careful not to disrupt the space. The sun rose higher, casting warm light into the alcove. The desert was alive with movement. Small lizards scurried over rocks, birds sang in the distance, and the wind whispered softly through the canyon. The team paused for a moment, taking it all in. There was a sense of peace, a recognition that they were not merely observers but participants in the living story of this land. Each of them felt a deep connection to the desert, to its history, and to the lessons it had taught. As the afternoon approached, they returned to camp for a brief rest. The experience of the storm, the careful exploration, and the discoveries had left them physically tired but mentally energized. Around the fire, they reflected on what they had learned. Daniel spoke first, acknowledging how much he had underestimated both the desert and the importance of patience and respect. Maya shared how the experience had changed the way she viewed her work and the way she would approach future projects. Thomas expressed his awe at the desert's beauty and power, noting that his photographs could only capture a fraction of what he had witnessed. Iana listened quietly, her thoughts filled with pride and contemplation. She understood that the storm had been a teacher, and the aftermath had been a test of growth. Each member of the team had learned something vital, not just about the desert, but about themselves. They had learned humility, the importance of trust, and the value of respecting forces greater than themselves. These lessons would guide them long after they left the desert. The team spent the following days carefully documenting the site, guided by the principles they had learned. They worked slowly and deliberately, ensuring that nothing was disturbed unnecessarily. Yana shared stories of her ancestors, teaching the others about survival techniques, the importance of community, and the wisdom embedded in the land. Daniel listened and learned, often asking questions he might not have considered before. Maya's notes grew more detailed and thoughtful, reflecting not just observation but understanding. Thomas's photographs captured the essence of the desert, showing both its beauty and its lessons. During one of their final days in the field, the team discovered a small stream hidden among rocks. It was a precious source of water in the arid desert, and it had likely been a vital resource for people long ago. Yana explained how her ancestors would have relied on such streams, planning their movements around water and shelter. The team marveled at the ingenuity and adaptability of those who had lived here centuries before. It was a humbling moment, reminding them that survival required not just courage, but knowledge, patience, and respect. As their time in the desert drew to a close, the team gathered for a final reflection. They sat together on a small plateau overlooking the vast expanse, the sun setting in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The desert was quiet, serene, and timeless. Each member of the team spoke about their experiences, the lessons learned, and the ways they had grown. Daniel admitted that he had changed, realizing that ambition without respect could be dangerous. Maya shared her newfound appreciation for careful observation and mindfulness. Thomas spoke of the desert's enduring power and beauty. Iana, finally, spoke last. Her voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet authority. "The desert teaches us many things," she said. "It teaches respect, patience, courage, and the value of community. It teaches us to observe, to listen, and to care for what is precious." What we have seen here, what we have learned, is more than artifacts or notes. It is a part of our understanding of the past and a guide for how we should live today and in the future. The team listened, absorbing her words. They realized that the desert had given them more than knowledge. It had given them wisdom. The storm, the challenges, and the careful exploration had changed them in ways they could not have anticipated. They had learned to trust, to respect, and to work together. They had learned that survival was not just about skills, but about character, integrity, and awareness. As night fell, the team packed their equipment and prepared to leave. The desert, which had tested them, now seemed to offer a quiet farewell. The wind whispered softly over the sand, and the stars appeared, scattered across the dark sky. The team paused for one final look, taking in the beauty, the history, and the lessons they had learned. Each of them carried memories that would remain long after they returned to civilization. Gianna stayed a moment longer, walking a short distance from the camp. She knelt in the sand, letting her fingers trace the grains and feeling the energy of the land beneath her hands. She thought of her ancestors, of the people who had walked this desert before her, and of the lessons they had left behind. She whispered a quiet thanks, not just for their guidance, but for the opportunity to share it with others who would carry it forward. When she returned to the team, she found Daniel, Maya, and Thomas already gathered, ready to depart. There was a sense of unity among them now, a bond forged through challenges, reflection, and shared growth. They left the desert together, each carrying a piece of its wisdom, a part of its story, and the understanding that they had been part of something much larger than themselves. The journey back to civilization was quiet. Each team member reflected on the experience, thinking about how it had changed them. They discussed future plans, ways to share the knowledge they had gained, and how to honor the lessons of the desert in their work and in their lives. Gianna listened, pleased to see that the respect and care she had hoped to instill had taken root. The desert had tested them, taught them, and ultimately strengthened them. By the time they reached the edge of the desert, the sun was high, warm, and bright. The landscape had returned to its familiar vastness, but for the team, nothing would ever be quite the same. They had faced fear, overcome challenges, and learned to trust one another. They had seen the desert's power and beauty, and they had emerged wiser, stronger, and more connected to the past and the present. As they left the desert behind, Iana glanced back one last time. The land stretched endlessly, silent and eternal, carrying the stories of those who had come before. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the lessons of this journey would remain with them all, shaping their future actions and understanding. The desert had given them a gift, wisdom, perspective, and the reminder that life, history, and nature are to be approached with care, respect, and humility. And so, the team returned to the world beyond the desert, carrying not just notes, photographs, and measurements, but a profound understanding of the value of patience, courage, and respect. The storm, the challenges, and the discoveries had all led to a greater realization that the lessons learned in the quiet, harsh, and beautiful desert were lessons that would last a lifetime.